Moo! Coalball, crouched beside him, froze, its glossy black eyes locked on the fleeting band of pink starlight. Dylan blinked, a little surprised himself. So that money wasn't wasted after all. He flicked his wand again. Lumos. Swish. The soft pink light chased away the gloom in the room. Tiny, shimmering particles scattered like stardust, weaving and colliding, each contact igniting another flicker of pink. Moo! Coalball sprang forward, pouncing at the light. Of course, it hit nothing. Moo? It mumbled, confused. Dylan grinned. He flicked his wand once more, and another splash of pink starlight bloomed. Coalball leapt again, tail and paws all enthusiasm. Hey, this is great! He hadn't expected decorating his wand to turn it into a cat teaser. Dylan played with Coalball for nearly the whole afternoon, tiring them both out. It wasn't until the sounds of footsteps and chatter in the corridor, signs that the other students were returning, that he finally stopped. He sighed, looking down at the sleepy creature with a fond smile, and scratched Coalball under the chin. The creature closed its eyes in contentment, emitting a soft, rumbling hoo-moo as it rubbed its head against Dylan's hand. Dylan laughed quietly at the little beast's clumsy affection. Even after all that play, he didn't feel it had been time wasted. In fact, examining his mood, he realized a weight had lifted from his chest. His stress had melted away, leaving him much lighter. Dinner will help too, he thought. I won't overdo it, though. After dinner, he went straight back to the dorm and slept hard. When Harry, Ron, and the others shuffled in later that evening, they found him out cold and, surprised, instinctively lowered their voices and moved quietly. The next morning, Dylan had just finished washing when a rich, roasted smell reached him. Pumpkin. He drew in another deep breath. Halloween. He didn't usually pay much attention to holidays, but the scent of pumpkin was unmistakable. Wasn't it at the Halloween feast that a troll appeared? He murmured, walking toward the allery with his satchel slung over one shoulder. His memory was fuzzy. He thought the troll had been let loose by Quirrell, and that Harry and his friends had somehow ended up in the girls' bathroom and used the levitation charm they'd just learned to beat it. That was the part he remembered most clearly, how the newly learned spell had turned the tide. Trolls were rare. Not only were they few, but their parts were valuable for potion making. Teeth could enhance the potency of certain brews, livers could be used for cures to severe illnesses or curses, and even their mucus had peculiar magical properties useful in medicine. If a troll was roaming Hogwarts today, Dylan thought, gathering those ingredients might save him a lot of searching. He went to the Allery, fed Luna, and handed her the letter to his parents, then made his way to the Great Hall for breakfast. Classes ran the day away, and soon the students filled the hall for the Halloween feast. When Dylan drifted through the crowd toward where Harry and Ron were standing, he noticed Ron looked glum. "Everything all right?" Dylan asked quietly. Harry glanced at Ron, then at Dylan. "You did very well in charms this morning," he said. "Your levitation charm was excellent." "So?" Dylan cocked an eyebrow. Harry hesitated, then glanced at Ron again. After Professor Flitwick called Hermione up to practice the levitation charm again, because Hermione didn't do as well as you, Ron said something nasty about her. And then, Dylan's hazy understanding cleared. He'd usually been the center of attention in class. Teachers tended to call on him, so he hadn't noticed the little dramas on the other side of the room. Hearing Harry, he groaned inwardly. "And Hermione caught him, didn't she?" Harry nodded, heavy with understatement. Dylan couldn't fathom why Ron liked to badmouth people so openly. If you were going to insult someone, be discreet. Don't get caught, he thought. It's not as if he's kept his mouth shut for long, he muttered. Actually, Ron hasn't been saying anything about Hermione for a while, Harry said, but this time, Hermione felt he didn't consider her a friend at all. His mouth tightened. And she thinks he's been saying lots of things about her behind her back. Dylan clicked his tongue. For a moment, he was speechless. So what happened after that? Where is she now? She spent the latter half of class in tears. We haven't seen her all afternoon. Harry looked guilty. Dylan's mind did a quick calculation. He'd planned to sneak into the girls' bathroom, deal with the troll quietly, collect the materials, and get out without anyone knowing. He hadn't expected Ron to precipitate the situation by driving Hermione back into the bathroom in tears. It felt almost too convenient. Who knew girls could be so troublesome? Ron complained, trying to defend himself. I said I was only joking, and it's not like she did better than Dylan today. Harry added, but you called her pretentious. Was I wrong? Ron snapped. Even if I didn't do the spell well today, she didn't have to lecture me. Dylan listened and shook his head faintly. He didn't know whether to roll his eyes or sigh. So that was the cause. Dylan watched the kids go from boisterous to terrified and felt strangely speechless. A flash of his own childhood passed through his mind. Had he been like Ron and the others, prone to tantrums? He shook his head. That life was too far behind him. He'd lived twice over, and the details had faded. At that moment, a commotion erupted in the great hall. Quirrell burst through the doors, pale and shaking. "Troll! In the dungeons! There's a troll!" he cried. Dylan hardly looked up from his plate of lamb chops. Harry, beside him, nearly choked on his mashed potatoes. He started coughing, then Dylan pushed a glass of milk into his hands. Harry drank gratefully until his breathing steadied. The younger students who had been laughing a moment before were now screaming and panicking. The older ones were rattled too, sitting up and scrambling for their wands. Chaos spread through the hall, and yet no one rushed to help Quirrell, who had already collapsed on the floor. Quiet! A purple flare of sound cut through the noise. Old Deng's voice boomed from above, amplified perfectly by a sonorous charm. His tone was rich and commanding, enough to silence the room in an instant. All prefects, take your students back to their dormitories. Dylan had studied the sonorous charm. Having already mastered 6 dark arts spells at max level, he found it easy to deduce other spells' mechanics. He'd picked up a lot of different charms, to at least a modest degree, without laboring over them. His rule was simple: learn it first, worry about mastery later. Knowing a little about many things often sparked insight that raised his overall skill. In his head, he graded Old Deng's sonorous, certainly at least level 8. The voice was grand but mellow, with no harshness or static, a nearly perfect cast. Percy Weasley moved through the Gryffindor first years like a whirlwind, herding them up. Stop eating and line up. Put down that wizard worm puff and come along. He grabbed one child's pastry. And you, who's eating screaming pickled tongue snail? Too spicy for you. Move it along. Harry and Ron pressed close to Dylan as they left the hall, faces full of worry. They looked at him as if he could make everything right. There really is a troll? Harry said. And Hermione wasn't at dinner. Do you think she knows about it? She probably doesn't, Dylan said. The news had just broken. How would Hermione already know? The relief in their faces was short-lived. Then we have to find her, Harry insisted. We can't just leave her. Dylan considered the options. If he went straight to the dungeons, he might run into professors, and that would be trouble. If he went with Harry and Ron, he'd risk being seen casting anything suspicious. He had already adapted his attack visual, turning Avada Kedavra into something that looked like Diffindo, pink starlight particles. That way, even if someone watched him end a threat, they wouldn't be able to tell which spell he'd used. His use of certain dark arts left no telltale residue a careful professor could trace. If Harry saw him acting and reported it, other teachers still wouldn't know what spell had been cast. We must find Hermione, Harry repeated, voice steady. Ron didn't hesitate. He took hold of both their hands and slipped out of the line. Dylan followed, mimicking the practiced, low-profile movement of kids used to sneaking. He thought, not for the first time, that it was a pity his system didn't include a pet taming function. There would be so much a tamed troll could offer. They rounded corners and ducked into shadows, voices lowered to whispers as they threaded through corridors. Suddenly, Harry yelped and flattened them against the wall, pulling them into a darker recess. A black robe swept past in the corridor, Professor Snape by the look of it. The trio held their breaths until he passed. "Where do you think she is?" Ron asked in a hush. "I heard she went to the girls' bathroom and was crying," Harry said. "Then let's check it." Dylan waited until Snape's footsteps were a memory and pulled out his wand. "Disillusionment charm," he murmured. It wasn't the simplest spell. Dylan's disillusionment was only at level 5, but his broader magical base made it effective enough to fool students and most teachers at a glance. He formed the charm, molding the subtle shimmer in a way that would cloak them without drawing attention. A scatter of pink starlight drifted from his wand, settling over the three of them. The effect was oddly charming rather than threatening. Soft, twinkling particles that blurred outline and color. Harry and Ron stared, mouths open. "Dylan, you?" Harry began, wonder and disbelief mingling in his voice. Chapter 43. The pink fluffy rabbit killed the giant monster. Specks of pink light, tiny like glittering gems, spread toward Dylan and the two boys beside him as if the starlight itself had been summoned. The three figures blurred inside the dreamlike pink glow. Their outlines softened and began to melt into the corridor around them. "This is my latest wand flash spell," Dylan said. "This special effect makes the spell stronger." He wasn't lying. Dylan had noticed that whenever he didn't try to trigger these cosmetic effects, something felt off. Spells felt less smooth. If he let the pink starlight particles play along naturally, the casting felt slicker, and the power seemed to rise a little. He suspected it was a hidden bonus from beautifying the wand. The system only said spending galleons could change a wand's skin, but it hadn't said changing the skin couldn't augment performance. That thought made Dylan want to throw all his galleons at wand skins, but he worried the wand might end up so flashy Professor Snape would have questions. He resolved to experiment more during a short holiday or the winter break when he could practice alone. Oh my goodness. Ron stared at his nearly invisible hand, visibly shocked. Dylan could make such an advanced effect? Were they really all first-year Hogwarts students? Harry poked his head out into the corridor. Professor Snape just passed by. He was heading probably toward the 4th floor. Harry sounded uneasy. Why would Snape be on the 4th floor? Dylan thought for a moment. The Philosopher's Stone, if anyone were after it, I want to go see, Harry said suddenly. Dylan blinked. No way. Aren't you still worried Hermione might run into that troll? Harry hesitated. And if Snape finds out you're doing something dangerous, he'll skin you alive. Dylan lost patience. My disillusionment charm isn't stable yet. It could dissipate at any moment. We need to hurry. Ron shot Dylan a look, then glanced again at his semi-transparent hand. Not stable, huh? He muttered, pouting. Maybe Hermione hadn't been so wrong. The three slipped down the corridor toward the girls' lavatory. Dylan immediately frowned. What a foul smell. A rotten, nauseating stench hit him full in the face, drilling into his nostrils. Bubblehead charm! A flash of pink starlight formed a transparent bubble over Dylan's head. Some of the smell still seeped through, but the charm gave him breathing space. What kind of spell is that? Ron asked, eyes wide. I already said the name, Dylan replied, and pushed open the lavatory door. Inside stood a huge, grotesque troll, its back to them. It lumbered awkwardly down the line of cubicles, its huge nose sniffing at each one as if hunting for something. The troll froze when Dylan opened the door and turned. Its small, bell-shaped eyes widened at the sight of them. Roar, it bellowed. Who are you yelling at? Dylan said coolly and flicked his wand. Crucio. A spray of dazzling pink starlight shot from his wand and engulfed the troll. The particles sank into its skin. Where the light touched, the troll's fierce expression twisted into agony, and it let out a raw, horrible cry. The troll's thick arms flailed uncontrollably. It pounded its own chest, trying to escape the pain. Harry and Ron reached the door just then and froze at the sight, mouths open. What is that spell? Ron managed. Soul-stinging spell, Dylan said offhand, inventing a name on the spot. Before the beast could recover, Dylan raised his wand again and shouted, Incendio. At the same moment, he silently wove a darker charm in his head, Fiendfire, one of the 6 max-level dark arts he had secretly mastered. He didn't need to speak. The wandless, voiceless threading of the curse strengthened what he cast aloud. Harry and Ron only heard Dylan say, Incendio. The pink starlight erupted and swirled as if alive, coalescing into a shape. A pink, fluffy rabbit, its fur a blaze of magical fire. It sat up on its haunches, ears pricked, ruby eyes glowing, tiny fangs bared. The lavatory echoed with the oddly cute squeak it made. The troll, bewildered, recoiled. The pink rabbit leaped and bit into the troll's neck, its fiery little jaws clamped tight. The burst of flames from the starlight seared the troll's skin, and the air filled with the awful mix of burnt flesh and the troll's own stench. Harry and Ron, not protected by a bubble, gagged at the smell and vomited. Dylan tracked the movement of the troll's head and barked another, Incendio! A second pink rabbit, smaller and unbelievably quick, shot out of his wand. It darted across the room and, while Harry and Ron were retching, leapt onto the troll's shoulder. The little creature cocked its head, then drove itself forward with a tiny explosive push, burrowing straight into the troll's skull. The troll's agonized roar cut off mid-bellow. Its limbs went limp, its eyes dimmed, and its life seemed to drain away like a tide receding. With a final shudder, its massive bulk collapsed to the floor, the impact shaking the lavatory. Ron wiped his mouth, eyes huge. Oh my goodness, the pink fluffy rabbit killed the troll. Chapter 44. Professor Snape, are you guarding the Philosopher's Stone? Did it just die? Harry, having finished retching, turned his head and stared in disbelief at the troll lying motionless on the floor. Is it playing dead? I've heard some monsters are really cunning. Maybe some are. Trolls aren't, Dylan said evenly. It was his first real use of the dark arts, and the rush from expending magic made his head swim. Even with his current power, he couldn't unleash the full force of dark magic, but he had still cast 3 spells and killed a troll with ease. By Lord Voldemort, the dark arts are effective. Dylan stepped forward and pushed open the stall doors one by one. In the 3rd stall, he found Hermione, fainted and slumped against the door. Enervate! Pink starlight shot from his wand and washed over Hermione. Her lashes fluttered, her eyes opened slowly, and she blinked back to awareness. She saw Dylan in the doorway and 2 heads peeking out from either side. Am I in heaven? She murmured, still dazed. Don't worry, Miss Granger, Dylan said mildly. Given Ron's description of your sharp tongue, you might be going to hell instead. Hermione blinked in stunned silence. Hey, Dylan, how can you say that? The head on the left snapped indignantly. Ron's face was crimson. The head on the right, the one with the black-rimmed glasses, lifted as well. What Dylan said isn't wrong. Aren't you going to apologize, Ron? Ron's cheeks flamed, and his eyes flicked guiltily toward Hermione. Hermione was finally gathering herself. She hauled herself up and demanded, Why are you here? Hide! There was a troll! Don't worry, Harry said at once. Dylan's already dealt with it. What? Hermione's eyes widened. Ron's blush softened into a sheepish expression, and he muttered under his breath, I'm sorry about this morning. Hermione, still shaken from a brush with death, barely registered the apology. Wait here. I'll go up and see if any professors are around. Dylan gave a quick word of reassurance and told Harry and Ron to look after her, then went out of the underground classroom. Because he'd killed the troll so quickly, nobody outside had realized a fight had taken place. He went up 2 floors but found no professors. Are they all on the 4th floor? He wondered. A troll suddenly lumbered into the castle, and by the looks of it, a rush of professors and students were heading up to the 4th floor. Dylan guessed most of the staff had gone to protect the Philosopher's Stone. Just as he turned the corner on the 4th floor, a low, stern voice cut through the corridor. Who's there? Wait, Professor. Don't cast a spell, Dylan said as he stepped into view. Professor Snape, black-robed and severe, started at the sight of Dylan. His face darkened. His thick black brows drew together like 2 coiled snakes, and cold, hawk-like eyes snapped toward him. At this hour, you're not in your dormitory, and you've run all the way up here? Dylan began to explain, then saw Snape's impatience and tightened expression and changed his tone. It'll be quick, Professor. Hermione went missing today, and when Harry heard a troll might be here, he dragged Ron and me off to look for her. We happened to run into you on the way, but we were looking for Hermione, so we didn't stop to salute. We ran down to the underground classroom's lavatory and found that troll trying to hurt Hermione. I used incendio and burned it to death, so I came to find a professor to report it. I didn't meet anyone on the way, so I thought you might be on the 4th floor. Snape's black eyes widened, a rare tremor of surprise flickering through his pupils. What did you say? Dylan blinked. Did you want me to? Say it again, Professor? Snape's thin lips set into a hard line, and his gaze pinned Dylan. You say you killed the troll yourself? Dylan nodded. He caught the look on Snape's face and, unable to resist, offered an innocent little smile. Since I found the troll and handled it, I thought its remains would make good materials. Snape's pupils pinched even tighter. A first-year claiming to have killed a troll and then asking to take its corpse for study? How exactly did you kill the troll? Like I said, Professor, Incendio. It might have been finished off by Defindo too, but it was already charred and I couldn't tell. Snape's brows drew together as he studied the boy coldly. Dylan glanced past him and then, impulsively asked, "Professor, are you guarding the Philosopher's Stone?" Snape's expression broke like glass. "You?" His lips parted as if to say more, but the words choked off. A few greasy black strands of hair fell from his forehead, softening his usually tight features for the briefest moment. "How did you know about the Philosopher's Stone?" Dylan shrugged. "Harry, didn't he and Hagrid go to Gringotts to get it? He said he'd even been chased by Peeves. He said he met a Cerberus too." Snape's eyes narrowed until slits. "Harry, a Cerberus?" He blinked twice as if trying to steady himself. "That reckless, foolish, insufferable Potter." Snape spun on his heel and strode off, his black robes billowing. "Come, down to the underground classroom." Chapter 45. "Hey, old guy Snape! Hagrid told you about the Philosopher's Stone?" A low voice came from ahead. Dylan shook his head. "I pieced it together from some things Harry mentioned. Besides, when I went to see Hagrid earlier, he let a few things slip. That confirmed for me it was the stone." A while back, Neville had dragged Dylan along to Hagrid's. After Hagrid mixed the special nutrients for the flamethorns, Dylan and Neville hung around the hut. While Neville fetched the nutrients, Dylan had chatted with Hagrid. Hagrid had almost said too much before stopping himself. Combine that with what Harry had told him, and it wasn't hard to guess what Hagrid had taken from Gringotts. "That fellow." Snape's voice was dark. "You can't blame him. He's been up nights worrying that the stone will be stolen. No doubt he's been suffering from insomnia and blurted things out." Dylan defended Hagrid with a single sentence. He'd brought up the Philosopher's Stone in front of Snape for two reasons. One, Hagrid had already slipped a lot to him. Though he hadn't spelled it out completely, anyone who knew Harry's story could put the pieces together. If Snape learned it now from Dylan, Dumbledore wouldn't have to be dragged in later. Dylan didn't want to deal with Dumbledore more than necessary. 2. Dylan didn't want to trick Harry. He suspected Dumbledore was orchestrating much of what had been happening around Harry recently, if not outright, then watching closely. Even if Dylan had used Incendio to hide some traces, it was better to tell a professor what he'd heard than pretend ignorance. And Snape was a fitting choice. A first year who knew about the stone but showed no interest in it, someone who appeared honest and dependable. Dylan admitted privately he had ideas about the stone. Not immortality. He wanted to study it. In this world, prolonging life by magic had terrible costs. Unicorn blood curses, Horcruxes ruin the soul and mind. The stone could lengthen life without those horrific side effects, and Nicholas Flamel's work suggested it was researchable. Even if the stone couldn't stop aging entirely, maybe research could push further. Magic, like science, advances with effort. Professor Snape led Dylan down a staircase. Halfway down, they ran smack into two people. "Huh? Dylan?" Professor McGonagall and Professor Quirrell were standing in their path. McGonagall looked at Dylan, slightly taken aback. Dylan opened his mouth to reply, but Snape cut in coldly. "He used my potion to deal with a troll." Dylan blinked, surprised, and shot Snape a quick look. "Really, this old man? What?" McGonagall's face froze, then she was suddenly alarmed. "You killed a troll? Where?" Dylan glanced toward Quirrell and pointed down the corridor. "In there. The bathroom. Harry and the others are with it." McGonagall's expression turned sharp, and she hurried off toward the underground classrooms. She went straight into the girls' bathroom and found a boy with a splotched face standing awkwardly to one side, apologizing to another boy. "I know I went too far. I'm sorry, Hermione." At that moment, Ron's words died as the three of them saw McGonagall storming in. Professor Snape followed, his face thunderous. Harry, Ron, and Hermione immediately ducked their heads. "You are reckless." McGonagall frowned, glancing at the troll sprawled beside a cubicle. The creature's hideous form had been burned almost beyond recognition. Its limbs were twisted and charred, the features singed away. Two dark, windowless eyes had been thrown aside on the floor, their hollow sockets staring blankly. "Was all this caused by you, Dylan? Using Professor Snape's potion?" McGonagall turned toward him as he entered the doorway. "What? Potion?" Ron started to protest, but Hermione pinched his arm hard and hissed. Ron's eyes widened and he clamped his mouth shut. Dylan nodded. I used incendio as well. That helped. Snape took 2 steps forward, lifted a handkerchief to his nose, and peered at the ruined troll. He narrowed his eyes but said nothing at first. Then he addressed Harry. I hear you brought Hawkwood and Mr. Weasley here. Harry blinked, then glanced at Dylan. Yes. Very well, Mr. Potter. Your carelessness almost caused a catastrophe. For this, Gryffindor will lose 20 points. But we came to find Hermione, Harry began. A missing classmate, McGonagall cut in sharply, and you did not inform a professor. You put yourselves at risk, and you argued back. Gryffindor will lose another 10 points. Snape's voice turned sterner still. If anyone has anything further to say in contradiction, I will recommend detention, and I will not object to overseeing it personally. Professor Snape, I know what Harry did was wrong. I will discipline him appropriately. McGonagall interrupted him. Snape gave Harry one more cold sweep of his gaze and fell silent. McGonagall looked at Harry with a warning in her eyes. Harry shut his mouth and lowered his head, but he sneaked a glance at Dylan. Why was he the only one being scolded? There were plenty of others who'd come with him. Chapter 46. You created a new spell? This troll. Professor Snape's voice was low. He glanced at Dylan, who blinked back with an expectant look. I'll hand the materials it can produce directly to you. Dylan's face brightened. All right, Professor. He hadn't even needed to extract them himself. Snape had already worked out how to get the ingredients from the troll. Snape then examined the corpse. A very powerful incendio. Dylan smiled politely. You did burn off its beard and snot, though. Next time, it's better not to use that spell. Dylan's smile faltered inwardly. What did Snape mean by that? Was he merely advising him not to destroy usable potion ingredients? Or had he noticed something else? Dylan glanced at the troll's body. Logically, with his buff, no one should be able to detect traces of dark arts. Snapey shouldn't have discovered anything. Dylan had even considered the scorching effects of Incendio versus Fiendfire. If he had used a max-level Fiendfire, he believed he could control the scarring precisely enough that a knowledgeable observer wouldn't immediately tell it apart. Calm down, he told himself. Even if someone guessed he knew Fiendfire, who could possibly guess he knew Avada Kedavra? As the thoughts tangled, he felt Snape's eyes on him and forced the stray musings away. He almost forgot. Snape was a master legilimens. Even without casting any spells, Snape could sense the emotional echoes of his thoughts. All right, go back and rest, Snape said. Professor McGonagall spoke then, and Snape withdrew his gaze from Dylan, shot a glare at Harry, and swept out of the room in a flurry of black robes. Harry rubbed his nose, bewildered. Why did that man always single him out? Dylan noticed that too. It looked like somebody might be in for trouble later. That has nothing to do with me, Dylan thought as he rose. Then I'll be going as well, Professor McGonagall, he said, smiling politely. He gestured to the professor and led Harry and the others out. Quirrell stood near McGonagall, watching Dylan leave with a flicker in his eyes. Dylan, who was also an accomplished legilimens, couldn't see what Quirrell looked at, but he felt a clear, curious gaze on him. He thought Lord Voldemort is on his face too. Dylan dealt with Harry and Ron's excited questions as they walked. He wondered privately, Quirrell is possessed by Voldemort. Can both of them be conscious at once, or is it only Quirrell who is in control while Voldemort stays silent? If Quirrell made a move against him, Dylan thought, he'd make sure Voldemort learned what the Crucio curse felt like. Back in the dormitory, Dylan picked up a book and began reading as if nothing had happened. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went off together, continuing their apologies. Seamus and Neville, who had been waiting for them, had questions, but when they saw Dylan immediately engrossed in his book, they exchanged looks and went to find Harry and the others instead. As November settled in, the air turned cold, and the surface of the Black Lake froze thick with ice. Dylan watched younger students skating, only to be chased off later by supervising teachers. One morning, he looked over at Luna and found the little creature curled up, unwilling to interact. Ah, what a pity. I bought some ferret meat strips. Since no owl wants them, I'll feed them to Coalball. Chirp, chirp. Luna, who had been tucking her head into her feathers, suddenly lifted it. Her ears pricked, eyes bright and fixed on Dylan. You little glutton, he teased. Dylan laughed and fed her a few strips, then headed to the Great Hall with plans to attend Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class after breakfast. The troll incident had been deliberately downplayed at Hogwarts and caused little public commotion. A few days after Halloween, Dylan received the potion ingredients Snape had promised. The parcel wasn't limited to troll parts. Snape had tucked many other rare and useful items inside, some of which were difficult to buy even with money. Dylan's appreciation for Snape grew. Even the professor's greasy hair seemed somehow impeccable to him. If anyone dared to say Snape didn't wash his hair, Dylan thought he'd jump out and set them straight. No, that greasiness was a deliberate, wizardly style. After a day of classes, Dylan sat with Professor McGonagall again. She had been tutoring him, and when she finished, he stayed behind a moment longer. "Professor, thank you for your guidance. It really deepened my understanding of transfiguration," he said sincerely. McGonagall regarded the clever young wizard with a satisfied, almost relieved expression. "It is my duty to cultivate Hogwarts' talent. You needn't thank me." Dylan smiled and drew his wand, not to do anything dark, but to demonstrate his latest research. "Oh, you've actually created a new spell?" McGonagall asked, surprised and interested. "Not created so much as innovated," Dylan corrected. He took the water cup from the table. "Would you like some tea or milk?" "Some tea, please," she replied, blinking. Dylan nodded, waved his wand, and spoke. "Lactea repleta." Tiny pink starlight particles flickered, and a rich milky scent with a faint tea aroma filled the air. The tip of his wand seemed to become a little enchanted spring. Milk tea arced through the air and poured precisely into the cups in front of them until they were full. "There you are," he said, grinning. "Very useful magic." McGonagall nodded, then glanced at the cups and the cup he had used. "I hope you don't expect me to drink from your personal cup." Dylan's eyelashes fluttered until he almost made Professor McGonagall sneeze. Realizing it, he scratched his head awkwardly and gave a sheepish chuckle. McGonagall let out a soft laugh too. With a flick of her wand, the teacup beside her slid a little closer. "Please do it again," she said. "Lactea repleta, sizzle, sizzle, sizzle." The cup filled quickly with milk tea, and a warm, inviting aroma rose from it. McGonagall reached out, examining the magically produced drink before looking up at Dylan. "Is this tea? Milk tea?" Dylan replied with a smile. McGonagall considered for a moment. "So whether I ask for tea or milk, you conjure this?" Dylan nodded. "Professor, you're too kind." She chuckled, shook her head, and swirled the cup. A thin layer of foam sat on the surface. The color was right and the smell pleasant. McGonagall took a small sip, then blinked in surprise. "The texture is smooth, the sweetness is balanced, and there's a good tea fragrance." A faint look of approval crossed her face. "Although it's produced by magic, it's very well done, Mr. Hawkwood. It seems you've made some interesting practical progress in your study of spells." Dylan's eyes lit up at the praise. "I'm glad you like it, Professor." He raised his own cup and tasted it. "Conjuration is, in a way, a branch of transfiguration. While working on transfiguration, I stumbled onto a new idea for conjuration spells and tried it out. I didn't expect it to work so well." McGonagall sipped again and set the cup down. Her gaze was gentle, and the corners of her mouth lifted in a rare smile. "If I'm not mistaken, this is a variation of aguamenti?" Dylan nodded. "It borrows from it, yes. This could be considered a new spell. I'm surprised you've reached this level." She paused, then changed her tone. "Researching new spells can be dangerous. If you ever want to create anything new in the future, come to me and I'll guide you." Dylan felt a flurry of gratitude and embarrassment, but he only managed a modest reply. "Wouldn't that be too much trouble for you, Professor?" McGonagall smiled. "It's been a long time since I've seen such a creative little spell or such a creative young wizard." She regarded him thoughtfully. "I do have one more thing to ask you." Dylan's heart gave a small leap, and he tried to look casual. "Yes, Professor?" "It's about the Quidditch match," she said. For a moment, Dylan worried someone had discovered something else, but then he relaxed. He hadn't known who'd leaked the news that Harry was on the Quidditch team. The leak had driven Wood mad. Harry had been his secretly trained player, saved for the big match, and now the secret was out. "The match is in 2 days. Would you be interested in joining the Gryffindor Quidditch team?" Dylan blinked. "Me, Professor, why would you ask that? My grades in flying aren't very good." McGonagall sat up straighter. "Don't hide anything from me. Whenever you have flying, I stand and watch. You're not bad at flying, You fly deliberately. At that, Dylan realized she had noticed his hidden skill in flying. You're too kind, he said, rubbing his nose. My understanding of flying is no less than Madame Hooch's, McGonagall went on. When you study spells, you seem aggressive but are actually steady. When you fly, you do so with care, as if you're guarding against falling. That steadiness shows a solid foundation. Dylan twitched the corner of his mouth and accepted the compliment. He could fly incredibly fast, but he instinctively controlled every movement to minimize error, not out of fear of death, but out of meticulousness and discipline. Thank you for the praise, Professor, but there are too many magical studies waiting for me. I'm sorry, but I can't accept. Seeing she was about to press him, he added, Besides, I'm honestly not very interested in Quidditch. Very well, McGonagall said with a regretful nod. Everyone has their own interests. That evening, Harry bounded up to Dylan, excitement written all over him. Hey Dylan, the Quidditch match is the day after tomorrow. You're coming to watch me, right? Dylan hesitated, then glanced at the eager light in Harry's eyes and smiled. I will. Yay! Harry jumped in delight. On the morning of the match, at 11 o'clock, the stands were packed. Nearly the whole of Hogwarts had come, a sea of heads and robes, colors and banners rippling together. Dylan arrived just in time, having dashed from the library, and found the spot Ron had saved for him. Above his head, a dirty bedsheet banner flapped, painted in large, uneven letters, Potter is the best! There were 3 exclamation marks. Dylan stared at the makeshift banner, stunned. He scratched his face. Is this for? Cheering him on, Ron called, grinning and waving. Dylan looked at Hermione, who just flicked her wand. The letters on the sheet shimmered and shifted through bright colors until the banner gleamed proudly in the sun. Dylan's eyes widened. Harry will definitely win, Ron shouted, voice full of confidence. Chapter 48, Jinx. The lion has to be gold, Hermione, Seamus called as his words drifted over the stands. Dylan glanced toward the other side of the banner and saw a lion there that didn't look remotely lion-like. I drew this, a bright voice said. Dylan turned to see Dean grinning proudly. Neville rubbed the back of his neck. I just happened to have a bedsheet I didn't want anymore. You brought the bedsheet? Dylan asked, looking at the chubby boy. When Neville nodded, he absently scratched his head with his wand. Well, if that's the case, shouldn't I do something too? Neville blinked. Before he could answer, Dylan's wand was already moving. Vera Verto, he said. Pink starlight glittered from the tip, vivid and dreamlike in the sunlight. Magic seeped into the bedsheet. The sheet shivered, and then the painted words and figures seemed to wake, gaining weight and presence. The slogans leapt up into small, cute cartoon characters that bounced along the cloth, changing colors as they went. Potter is the best, they shouted in unison. The ugly lion's sketch on the sheet suddenly became defined. Its outline hardened, colors deepened, and then it sprang off the bedsheet and took on a majestic cartoon form. The creature was solid and golden, its mane aflame with motion, and it pranced around the cheering text figures, letting out a triumphant roar. Ron, Neville, and the others who'd been watching gaped. Merlin's nose, that's brilliant, Ron yelled. Hermione looked surprised. Dylan's transfiguration had been unexpectedly skilled. Turning words into physical, even animated beings was no simple trick, and a ripple of astonished looks swept through the younger students nearby. By this time, Madame Hooch had arrived in the center of the Quidditch pitch. Players from both teams were already on their brooms. I expect this match to be fair, she called from the pitch. No cheating of any sort. The whistle blew. Dozens of broomsticks rose into the air as the stadium filled with shouts and excitement. Dylan hadn't been particularly keen on Quidditch before, but the charged atmosphere swept him up. He felt a buzz he hadn't felt in a long time. A deep voice said beside him, "Excuse me, please." Dylan looked over and saw Hagrid settling into the row, taking up the space of half a dozen seats. The smaller students scooched to make room. Hagrid smiled at the pitch but kept his eyes on Dylan. Very impressive magic. You've got a real knack for spells. Dylan returned the smile. Just a few tricks, but thanks. Hagrid chuckled, patted his beard, and then asked Ron, "The golden snitch appear yet? I only just got here." "Not yet," Ron said, eyes glued to the field. Dylan concentrated on the match. He hadn't memorized all Quidditch rules, but enough to know that catching the snitch usually decided the game. Without it, both teams were scrapping for the quaffle. Watching the play, he noticed something familiar in the way players shoved and targeted each other. No matter the sport, personal fouls seemed inevitable. Suddenly, a gold flash shot across the sky. The seeker from Slytherin and Harry sprang after it at the same instant. Just as Harry reached out to grab the snitch, another Slytherin player shot in from the side and rammed into him, sending Harry careening off his broom. He nearly lost his grip and tumbled through the air. "Hey, that's dirty!" Ron shouted. "They fouled him." Professor McGonagall was standing in the opposite stands, her expression tightened. Madam Hooch flew up, scolding the Slytherin, and Gryffindor was awarded a free kick. But the immediate chance to end the match by catching the snitch, so close a moment before, had vanished. "That should be a straight red card," Dean fumed. "This isn't football," Siemis said. "Where would they get red cards?" Everyone in the stands was angry, Hermione included. Dylan's eyes tracked the play, and then something else reached him, a subtle, carefully concealed magical trace. Since he'd adjusted the way his wand displayed its attack effects, he'd become more sensitive to different spell auras. Now he could feel the faint signature of something dark hidden in the air. "Jinx," he breathed. He recognized the spell instantly. A jinx was a nasty, low-level curse. Not as lethal as some dark magic, but it seeded repeated misfortune and interference in the victim's life. If such a jinx struck a wizard flying at speed, it could send them spiraling off their broom or send the broom itself into wild, dangerous behavior. Dylan's jaw tightened. Whoever had done this, Quirrell, maybe, was probably testing whether Dumbledore was still at Hogwarts or trying to see what they could get away with. The jinx struck. Harry, who had been regaining his balance, suddenly went limp and began to convulse in the air. His broom behaved as if possessed, jerking, bucking, and then rocketing skyward with Harry clinging on, helpless. Chapter 49. Professor Quirrell vomited all over everyone. "What's going on?" Hermione frowned. "Is that broom so old it's falling apart?" Hagrid frowned back. "No, only the dark arts can make a broom go haywire." "What?" Hermione snapped, grabbing the binoculars Hagrid had been holding. She scanned the field and quickly spotted someone making a movement with his wand. "Snape, he's casting a spell." "Ah!" Ron's eyes went wide. "Professor Snape's gone mad. He's trying to—" Hermione shoved the binoculars at him. "Look!" Ron took them and peered through. Sure enough, Snape was muttering, wand going in steady, quick motions. "Of course we have to stop him." Hermione sprang up, ready to run around the stands and get to Snape's side. "Do you want to see this?" Dylan said, taking the binoculars from Ron and putting them in front of Hermione. He adjusted them, aimed, and waited. "Is that Professor Quirrell? He's casting a spell, too." Hermione froze. Quirrell, the stammering teacher who always lugged textbooks around and looked perpetually flustered, was actually casting a spell? She blinked in disbelief. Dylan's mouth twitched. "Yeah, Quirrell's class is boring as old socks, but he can still cast a spell." "He's trying to make Harry lose control of his broom," Hermione said. "But if someone casts a counterspell, Harry should be able to get control back." "But which spell could Quirrell be using?" Ron frowned. "Don't panic." Dylan lifted his wand and aimed it toward Quirrell. Hermione shot him an incredulous look. "You're going to cast from here?" Dylan smiled faintly and mouthed a charm. "Finite incantatum." He said it quietly, but what he actually did was different. He hadn't wanted to use anything that would plainly mark him as using dark arts in front of all these people. He feared being watched. Old Deng might be anywhere in the crowd, watching wizards and students alike. If Old Deng noticed him using a dark charm, the consequences could be immediate and terrible. So Dylan hid what he did behind the shape of a harmless countercurse. He let the real spell fly, Confundo. The charm traveled across half the stadium and struck Quirrell, who was struggling with Snape over his next incantation. Quirrell's mouth twitched. He grimaced as if a sudden pain had stabbed at his head. His face drained of color, his pupils contracted, and his lips trembled. He doubled over, hands on his knees, trying to steady himself, and then his throat convulsed. With a choking sound, his mouth flew open, and a yellowish-green spray burst out in a wide fan. It sprayed forward like a shotgun blast. Soft, sodden breadcrumbs, limp green leaves, and some indistinct, slimy paste were thrown across the first rows. People in the front gasped and had no time to dodge. Some were hit in the face, blinking and rubbing their eyes. Others leapt up with a scream as the mess splattered across their robes. A number of students, already terrified by Harry's out-of-control broom above, just stood shocked until the smell hit them. "Ah!" someone retched. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" Another voice joined. The sound spread like the start of an infection. Those in the nearest rows gagged and began to vomit in sympathy. Chaos erupted in the stands as people scrambled away from the stinking spray. Professor Quirrell kept vomiting, head down, hands on his knees, utterly unable to stop. Professor Snape, who had been about to send another jinx, looked up in stunned confusion, but the jinx on Harry was gone. The boy in the air stopped veering wildly by the time the next spell could have been cast. Hermione shoved the binoculars away, covering her mouth with one hand, her face pale. What happened?" Ron demanded, impatient. Hermione couldn't get the words out. Ron snatched the binoculars back and peered through them. Professor Quirrell vomited all over them, he choked. "Ah! Don't you dare!" Dylan barked, glaring. Ron clapped his hands over his own mouth, then shoved the binoculars into Seamus's hands. Hermione took a few deep breaths, managed to drink some water, and stared at Dylan. "Did you do this?" Dylan blinked innocently. "Hey, I only said finite incantatum. From this far away, my spell might not have even reached him." He didn't volunteer what he'd actually done. Hermione looked at him, suspicious. He had moved his wand, but there had been no visible effect. Odd. "Was it really Quirrell who was casting the jinx?" she asked. There wasn't time to dwell. On the far side of the field, the stands were in uproar as students scrambled and wailed. A professor pushed toward the mess to restore order. The match didn't stop, but the section around Quirrell, those drenched by his vomit, lost interest in the game. They bolted for the dormitories to shower, grumbling that no amount of Scourgify would take away the smell in a hurry. Hagrid's hut. Dylan sat on the sofa, stirring the hot tea in his cup. A scent lingered at his nose, and he sniffed. "Snakefang nettle, stardust silver," he murmured. Harry sat on the other side, looking perplexed. The amber tea in his cup rippled and steam blurred his glasses. Through the haze, his gaze was fixed on Hermione. "So you're saying my broom went out of control because Professor Quirrell was messing with it and Professor Snape was actually trying to save me?" Hermione's expression was serious. "That's what it looks like. Snape is strict with us, but he doesn't strike me as someone who'd actually hurt a student." "A little strict?" Ron muttered beside her, mouth agape. Hermione shot him a helpless look, then turned to Dylan. "What do you think, Dylan?" Ron and Harry both looked at him. Dylan took his time answering and took another sip of Hagrid's brew first. Hiss, a sharp, numbing heat shot into his head. He closed his eyes. It felt almost like drinking strong liquor. The snakefang nettle left his tongue tingling, that prickling spreading through his mouth and making his lips tremble, as if countless tiny currents were dancing there. Why does Hagrid always make such odd things? He thought. When he'd recovered, he put down the cup and nodded at Hermione. "Snape's just strict, that's all. At least that's how I see him. And this time it really was Professor Quirrell using a nasty trick on you." Dylan added, looking at Harry. "He meant to use a jinx on you, but, well, you know what happened next. He made a bunch of kids start throwing up." At that, Hermione and Ron looked disgusted. Harry frowned. Maybe Snape was attacking me and Quirrell was trying to save me? Just then, Hagrid bustled over carrying a huge teapot. "Professor Snape would never hurt you, that's for sure." Harry's eyes widened. "What do you mean by that?" Hagrid hesitated, glancing between the students' teacups. Seeing that Dylan's cup was half empty, he nearly knocked his teapot into Dylan's lap. "Hey, Mr. Hagrid." Dylan's eyes widened. "That was freshly brewed tea." Oh, goodness, I nearly spilled it. I'm so sorry." Hagrid grabbed the teapot's handle, ready to lean over and refill Dylan's cup, but Dylan waved him off. "I'll stick to my milk tea. Your brew makes me feel like I'm drinking spirits." He flicked his wand and a stream of milk tea popped into the cup. "Wow, what new magic is that?" Ron gaped. "I made it myself," Dylan said, taking a contented sip. The other students were bewildered. Hagrid laughed. "I heard Professor McGonagall mention it. You're really something. Make me a cup too." Dylan obliged. Conversation drifted back to the forbidden fourth-floor room and the three-headed dog Fluffy. If Quirrell really meant to harm me, it's probably because I stumbled on whatever secret's in that room, Dylan said. Harry had been handed Dylan's milk tea and looked up. Fluffy? He said. That three-headed dog? Yeah, Hagrid said. I bought him off a Greek fellow last year, and then Professor Dumbledore borrowed him to guard. He only just stopped himself and glanced guiltily at Dylan. Harry, not noticing, leaned forward. What? What is he guarding? Dylan took another sip. Hagrid's mouth was like a sieve. He let everything out. The more Harry prodded, the more Hagrid started to babble until he finally lost his temper. That's enough, he barked, shoving them out of the hut. The door slammed so loudly the sound echoed. Harry rubbed his nose. Is Hagrid angry with me? Dylan smiled. Maybe he's angry at himself. Harry had, despite everything, managed to coax out that the creature in the forbidden room was guarding something connected to Nicholas Flamel. If that meant what it sounded like, then someone had just blurted out a very dangerous secret. No wonder Hagrid was furious. On the walk back to the castle, Hermione kept asking questions about the room. Dylan replied that he did know what was in there, but he'd promised Hagrid to keep quiet unless he could learn a max-level Unforgivable Curse. Hermione sighed, appalled at the thought of such a vow. Dylan just smiled but didn't elaborate. He headed straight to the library. He had barely sat down before a notification popped up in his mind. The achievement system had a new entry. Attack Professor. You wicked little wizard, you've taken your first bold step. Well done. Next time, why not try an unforgivable curse on a professor? Requirement to unlock. Cast a spell on a Hogwarts professor that causes negative consequences. Achievement reward. Max level basic spell +1. Dylan stared at the unlocked achievement, a twitch crossing his mouth. Up until now, his achievement rewards had been galleons and increases to his magic affinity for things like visiting new places or finishing courses and books. He hadn't expected that attacking Quirrell would get him a max-level spell as a reward. Chapter 51. The Weasley brothers want to have a snowball fight. Is this telling me to attack a professor? Looking at the symbol behind the achievement, Dylan could see it was part of a series, just like the earlier ones. There would have to be Attack Professor 2, Attack Professor 3, after this. This is driving me crazy. He rubbed his temples. Even when he'd killed a troll earlier, his only reward had been some potion ingredients, troll snot, a huge globby mass. It could fetch a good price, which at least made up for having used Fiendfire to finish the thing off. This time I only used Confundo on Quirrell, he muttered. What next? Defindo on a professor? Or? The thought of escalating spells on teachers made him snort. He opened his book and bent over it, but his eyes kept drifting to the top of the system panel. A star was shining there, less dazzling than the previous max-level spells, but bright enough to catch his attention. Let's see what spell I can draw this time. It's bound to be low-grade, nothing outrageous. As he watched, the star trembled, gold and silver colors swirling around it. It exploded and beams of light poured into him. A message flashed in his head. Congratulations! You have mastered the max-level magic. Ricta Sempra. The spell unfurled in his thoughts. Ricta Sempra, the tickling charm. The victim would burst into uncontrollable laughter. Not exactly practical, but it could at least briefly disrupt an opponent in a fight. Dylan shrugged. It wasn't dark arts. Good enough. He dismissed the panel and went back to his reading. After dinner in the Great Hall, he planned to visit the Owlery to see Luna. Meanwhile, behind a low stone wall near the path, Fred and George Weasley crouched, hiding. Each clutched several freshly made snowballs. Hey, we should have tried this ages ago. We hit Professor Quirrell on the back of the head. He looked proper awful. Doesn't matter. He won't bother us. Look, there's Dylan. Shh, get ready. Dylan walked past the wall without noticing them. At the same instant, the twins exchanged looks, leapt up and flung their snowballs with practiced force. Take that! Dylan, still thinking about the spell he'd learned that afternoon, was startled. He dodged one snowball, but another struck him squarely. Got him! The twins whooped and ran, expecting Dylan to chase. Instead, he stood still, eyes narrowed. A snowball fight, is it? He raised his wand. Nix implosion. The sky above their heads darkened, and a sheet of snow fell like a curtain. The two were buried beneath a heavy heap. Only flailing arms and shaking heads showed above the mound. Laughter stopped abruptly, and was replaced by surprised gasps. Dylan snorted and walked on toward the owlery. After feeding Luna and returning, he found the twins still half buried. He strolled over slowly. "Do you know you were wrong?" Yes, they panted. "We know we were wrong." Only then did he raise his wand again, not to free them. Ricta Sempra. Wait, Dylan, what did you just? George, I feel like laughing. Ah ha ha ha! Me too! Ah ha ha ha! Wait! Ha ha ha! Their protests dissolved into helpless guffaws. Time passed in squeaking, breathless laughter until even the snow around them began to glisten with it. Dylan finally lowered his wand and left them still giggling and half-buried, the lesson delivered. Christmas drew near. After a private lesson with Professor Flitwick, Dylan was led to the Great Hall. Professor McGonagall waited at the entrance. After brief greetings, Flitwick explained, "Let me test how well you've learned your charms. Do you see those Christmas trees?" Dylan looked around. Trees were scattered all over the grounds, and the hall itself, 11 enormous ones, stood in the Great Hall alone. "These trees are rather bare," Flitwick continued. "Conjure more decorations for them." Dylan glanced at McGonagall. She smiled and waved her wand. The ceiling above the hall shifted into a deep starry sky, twinkling with countless lights. Several larger stars streaked across, trailing silver tails, and delicate snowflake effects danced among them. Flitwick tapped his wand. Green vines snaked up from the table legs, curling around the edges. Holly sprouted red leaves and white berries. The plates picked up golden snowflake patterns, and the cutlery took the shapes of silver reindeer antlers. Dylan raised his wand. Swish! Pink starlight gathered where he pointed. Moisture in the air condensed into crystalline, translucent hexagonal flakes, thin as cicada wings, and they drifted onto the branches like fragile frost. He twirled the wand again. Strings of golden, shimmering candies tumbled onto the lower boughs, each wrapped in shiny paper. Then he summoned a flock of tiny, glowing elves. The little creatures carried colorful ribbons woven from magical silk and, at his command, flew up and cheerfully wrapped the branches in neat circles. "Oh, a very good frost-forming charm." Flitwick beamed. "And the candy summoning charm, well used as well." McGonagall smiled. "Is that the charm for summoning and binding the elves and the ribbon summoning? I just taught that to you." Dylan bowed modestly. "Thank you, Professor. It's nothing. My learning is just quick, that's all." Fred and George, hauling decorations a short distance away, looked up and watched the junior who'd been in the same compartment as them. "Hey, Dylan can already do all that with magic?" Fred grumbled. "And we're still lugging things by hand," George added, sounding bitter. They were both newly qualified. How could this first year be more fluent with charms than they were, only half a term in? Who was the senior here? As Dylan transformed a few branches into delicate musical baubles and sent a rain of iridescent feathers to drift onto the trees, he noticed the twins rounding the other side of the nearest tree. "You two helping the professors?" he called, genuinely friendly. They forced embarrassed smiles. The memory of the earlier snowball incident prickled at them, unpleasant and humiliating. They hurried on with their work, cheeks a little pink, while the hall filled with music, light, and the soft, steady hum of Christmas magic. Chapter 52. You want to learn defense against the dark arts? Tomorrow's Christmas Eve, Dylan. Any plans? Yes, I plan to continue researching how to use the spirit servant more flexibly. The Great Hall was nearly finished with its decorations when Professor McGonagall bent down to speak with Dylan. Hagrid came in carrying a Christmas tree. Professor Flitwick glanced over and said, "Just put it over there," pointing to a corner of the hall. Dylan gave a small wave of his wand and summoned a flurry of red and gold baubles that landed neatly on the tree. "Hey, Dylan, aren't you going home for Christmas?" Harry and Ron asked excitedly as they followed Hagrid in. "No." Dylan shook his head, then flicked his wand. Pink starlight particles danced, and a chocolate candy appeared in Harry and Ron's palms. "Avocado chocolate? I like that!" Ron tore off the wrapper and popped it in. His face lit up. Dylan conjured a few more and let Ron tuck them into his pockets. "Isn't this your first time away from home for so long? Don't you want to see your parents?" Hermione asked. Dylan hesitated and took a breath. When he first arrived at Hogwarts, he and his parents had written often. But as time passed, they seemed to settle into a comfortable life without him. He'd had Luna deliver letters twice, and one time he received no reply for days. Then a letter finally arrived full of affection, and Dylan had planned to pause his studies and spend Christmas with them, until a few sentences at the end changed everything. They decided to go on a trip over the holidays. They didn't need him to come home after all. "Wow, that's great! Then we can spend Christmas in the dormitory," Harry beamed. He was glad to avoid his aunt. "My parents are going on a trip too, so I'll be staying in the dormitory," Ron added, popping another chocolate into his mouth. "That settles it." Dylan blinked and smiled. "If I'm back from the library in time, we can spend Christmas Eve together." Ron swallowed his chocolate and suddenly asked, "Dylan, are you going to the library again?" Dylan nodded. Ron's eyes brightened. "Then come with us." "You're going to the library?" Dylan raised a brow. It was odd for Ron to want to study at the start of the holidays. Hagrid, who was passing by, overheard and stopped. "Do you remember Nicholas Flamel that I mentioned?" Ron whispered. "We want to go to the library and find out who he is." Dylan realized why Ron wanted to go. Just then Hagrid's expression went stiff as he remembered. "You're still trying to find out that?" You don't need to know what Fluffy's guarding." Hermione lifted her head. "We can't do anything about it if you won't tell us. We'll just look it up ourselves." Hagrid folded his arms. "You know I can't tell you." "So who is Nicholas Flamel then?" Harry pressed. Hagrid stayed silent. "It's fine. The Hogwarts library is huge. We'll find it ourselves," Hermione said, and the trio hurried out. Hagrid watched them go, worrying. True to form, the Gryffindors were stubborn. He looked at Dylan and asked anxiously, "You're keeping that to yourself, right?" "Of course," Dylan said with a small smile. Hagrid sighed in relief. "I hope their curiosity dies down." Dylan followed Harry, Ron, and Hermione to the library, but spent his time reading his own books quietly. The trio dragged out a stack of reference tomes and searched page by page for Nicholas Flamel, without success. By dinner, the search had come up empty. After the meal, Hermione said she was going home for the holidays, but Harry and Ron had already been caught up in games with the others and paid little attention to her plan. Dylan didn't join the games. Back in the dormitory, he put his things away, fed Coldball, then took his notebook and headed to Professor Flitwick's office. Most of the professors stayed at Hogwarts over Christmas, which made it easy for Dylan to seek extra lessons. Flitwick greeted him warmly. "Oh, Dylan, come in and warm yourself by the fire." The office stove crackled with orange flames, and Dylan felt the heat as he stepped inside. "Is there something you need?" Professor Flitwick asked, looking up from his book. Dylan stepped closer. "Do you remember what I asked you during our lesson today?" Flitwick thought a moment. "You mean about counterspells?" "Exactly," Dylan nodded. "I want you to teach me defense against the dark arts. Specifically, I want to learn a counter to the Fiendfire curse." Flitwick's face changed as he frowned. "Defense against the dark arts. If I'm not mistaken, Professor Quirrell shouldn't have been teaching the Fiendfire curse in class, did he?" Dylan gave a short, rueful smile. "Yes, Quirrell's teaching isn't reliable. I've been trying to learn by myself, but the textbooks hardly mention it. So I came to you," Dylan finished. "Professor Quirrell." Professor Flitwick cleared his throat. Quirrell had been a Ravenclaw, and so had Flitwick. As a fellow alumnus and a fellow Hogwarts professor, Flitwick thought he knew Quirrell's usual standard of teaching well enough. No student had ever complained about Quirrell's lessons in his hearing before, so when one did now, Flitwick felt a little taken aback. Dylan blinked. He'd spoken too quickly and hadn't reacted at once. Realizing it, he hurried on. "Professor Flitwick, the book only says that Fiendfire, being such a powerful dark spell, can be put out either with a counter curse or with a stronger terminating spell than finite incantatum." He met Flitwick's eyes. "And a single caster using finite incantatum isn't that strong. It only temporarily holds the Fiendfire back." Flitwick listened quietly, then asked, "Do you know how finite incantatum actually affects Fiendfire?" Dylan nodded. "Finite incantatum ends and suppresses magical effects. It's one of the most powerful counterspells. But Fiendfire is an extreme dark charm. It burns things to ash. Anything touched by Fiendfire will continue to burn until it is completely consumed. So finite incantatum can only bind the Fiendfire, forcing it to burn itself out. It doesn't truly counter the curse." Flitwick looked at him with surprise. He hadn't expected a first year to have thought so deeply about such an obscure, advanced spell. He had noticed Dylan's sharpness before, though, and after a moment's surprise, he grew thoughtful. A counter curse to fiendfire. Under ordinary circumstances, I don't think you'll see one in your lifetime. I certainly wouldn't expect a first year to encounter it. He hesitated. This was the dark arts after all. Even if it was a counter curse, Flitwick, as charms professor rather than defense against the dark arts, felt uneasy about teaching it. Still, he added, if you truly want to learn, understanding this might help with other spells. It's late now, though. Even if I'm willing to talk about it, tonight is not the time. Go back for now. When we next meet, I'll give you an answer. Dylan accepted the concession with a smile and a small bow. Thank you, Professor. I appreciate your guidance. Merry Christmas. Flitwick laughed and waved him off. Not quite Christmas yet, but the same to you. Politeness mattered to Flitwick, and Dylan's manners, progress, and intelligence all sat well with him. Dylan left Flitwick's office, turning the situation over in his head. Now that he'd mentioned wanting to learn a counter curse for the dark arts, it probably wouldn't be long before the other professors knew as well. The castle corridors were drafty and biting. Dylan decided to use the time and visit the other teachers, Snape for one. What? You want to learn the counter curse to fiendfire? A low, surprised voice answered, and the panes in Snape's office rattled in the cold. Snape regarded the earnest boy before him with narrowed eyes. No, I already told Flitwick. I wanted to ask if there's any other way to put out fiendfire. Why the sudden interest? Snape studied him, recalling the strange feeling he'd had when he'd last seen the troll's corpse. He said bluntly, You wouldn't be secretly studying the dark arts, would you? Dylan's smile didn't change, though he let a flicker of surprise show. Why would you think that? How could I learn the dark arts, Professor? I'm curious because I want to know what sets the dark arts apart from ordinary spells. I've read many books in the library but haven't found a clear explanation. I saw fiendfire in a book and wondered how it differs from an incendio or even a lumos solum. Listening to Dylan speak, Snape relaxed a fraction. If you're worried about countering fiendfire, you might as well prepare some acromantula venom. Snape's snort was all chill. Dylan's eyes lit up. Professor, acromantula venom can extinguish fiendfire? As with most things, Snape said. Yes, but in practice, if you face fiendfire, a little acromantula venom will only make you die faster. Dylan took this in. He hadn't known that the venom could counteract fiendfire. The idea of hunting acromantulas in the Forbidden Forest leapt into his mind. He'd meant only to ask Snape a quick question and move on, but he lingered, chatting until Snape, impatient, finally shooed him from the office. When the door slammed behind him, Dylan rubbed his nose. It's almost Christmas. There are no classes. Why can't he talk a little more? He headed toward McGonagall's office, but when he knocked, there was no answer. It was almost 10 o'clock. Has she already gone to bed? With McGonagall absent, Dylan couldn't very well run to Old Deng's and ask for tuition in counter curses. It had been a long evening, and tomorrow was Christmas, so he decided not to press it further and walked back to his dormitory. Chapter 54. Look at the defense against the dark arts. Professor, you found. The headmaster's office was flooded with silvery moonlight. Dumbledore, idly toying with a small bird perched on his finger, turned slowly at the sound of approaching footsteps. A gentle smile warmed his face. Phileas, Minerva, please sit. There's no need to hurry. Professor McGonagall stood ramrod straight, expression taut with concern. Beside her, Professor Flitwick was short but equally grave. This matter cannot be ignored, McGonagall said firmly. Dumbledore sat at his desk. I understand your worries. Dylan is a gifted child. To you, he may seem like an uncut gem, full of potential, but precisely because of his abilities, he is more likely to flirt with the edge of darkness. McGonagall shot a look at Flitwick, especially since he told me he wanted to teach himself defense against the dark arts. You should know better than anyone. If you try to learn this subject on your own, you can very easily go astray, Flitwick admitted, sheepish. He had intended to speak to Dumbledore after Dylan confided in him, but had run into McGonagall on the way. He hadn't been able to hide the boy's intentions. And here they were. Dumbledore smiled gently at them both. Young people are always curious about the unknown. I heard he killed a troll with incendio, McGonagall said, each word tight with disapproval. That does show remarkable learning and judgment, Dumbledore said. I suspect that, having read about fiendfire in a book and already mastering incendio, he thought he could combine the two and so thought to study defense against the dark arts. When it became clear neither of them would sit, Dumbledore rose and leaned on his desk. Our duty as teachers is not merely to prevent, but to guide. He moved to the window and looked out at the icy night. If he wants to learn, and we don't teach him, won't he just try to learn on his own? Didn't he come to you because he couldn't learn it clearly by himself, Filius? Flitwick asked. He did, Flitwick confirmed. Dumbledore turned back and smiled. Then if we give him a safe framework and the right direction, I believe he will not fall. After all, he is a Gryffindor, he added. Flitwick nodded. He's bright and quick. I don't actually see anything inherently wrong with him wanting to learn defense against the dark arts. McGonagall's mouth twitched. After a moment, she said, learning a counter curse to fiendfire is not in itself unreasonable, but he mentioned a new spell to me today. The entropy-splitting abnormality curse? Dumbledore and Flitwick asked together. McGonagall exhaled. In all my years, I have never seen such audacity in a young wizard. This far exceeds anything I had imagined. Flitwick frowned. What does that name even imply? It sounds unfriendly. McGonagall's eyes tightened. He's been experimenting with living transfiguration and hit a snag. Today, while we were discussing transfiguration, he suddenly brought up this spell. You can tell from the name, she went on. Dylan said that while transfiguration can be used in combat, it requires the caster to picture the form they want the opponent to become. He proposed instead a spell that would directly deform the opponent's body. Or even split the opponent into parts, Flitwick finished, shocked. To avoid producing something excessively monstrous, McGonagall continued, he suggested limiting it, split the opponent into two parts, or deform individual limbs, anything that would realistically weaken them in a fight. Her words hung in the air. For a moment the office was thick with silence. Finally, Dumbledore, choosing his words with care, spoke. He is, after all, only a first year. Many young wizards dream of applying transfiguration in combat. The theory isn't without merit, purely from a practical standpoint, but putting it into practice is dangerous and could lead a young mind astray. He sat again. Perhaps you can guide him, make him understand that creating spells is not so simple. And speak with him about shaping and secondary control of spells, he added. Those techniques can make an original charm produce a range of effects, some of them powerful. If he learns proper control, his ideas may be channeled safely. McGonagall considered this, then nodded. The shaping and secondary control of spells could indeed broaden a spell's possibilities. Lumos Solum, after all, is an advancement of incendio. She had not yet broached such topics with Dylan. They required a near-complete mastery of a spell. Still, discussing the correct direction might pique his interest and steer him away from dangerous experiments. Also, Filius, while defense against the dark arts does not normally teach a counter curse to fiendfire, Dylan is not an ordinary child. If you think he can master it, there is nothing inherently wrong with teaching him. Dumbledore reassured them both. After exchanging a few more looks, McGonagall and Flitwick took their leave. They had been gone only a short while when Dumbledore's gaze swung to the doorway. Severus, did Dylan come to you as well? A figure materialized from the shadows. Professor Snape, his expression stony. Look at the situation now, he said coldly. This is the defense against the dark arts professor you chose. What has he led such a promising child into? Dumbledore said nothing. Dumbledore picked up a cluster of cockroaches from the table. Care for one? Professor Snape recoiled, leaning back, his face twisted in disgust and his thin lips pressed together. I have no interest in that disgusting thing. Dumbledore shrugged. Suit yourself. They're quite tasty. I'm talking about Dylan, Snape said, his voice low. Dumbledore chuckled. I never pictured you worrying over a little Gryffindor. Snape's brow tightened. He's already gone down a very dangerous line. What do you mean? Dumbledore looked mildly surprised. He shouldn't have access to anything truly dangerous. He shouldn't, but it's not impossible. Snape snorted. Dumbledore regarded him with a raised eyebrow. You mean he might, out of curiosity, seek out forbidden spells that twist the mind? It's worse than that. Snape's smile was cold. If he finds a safe method, he will take it. Dumbledore frowned. Snape continued, "Today he didn't just ask me how to counter fiendfire. When you told him the answer, he began asking how love potion works." Dumbledore was startled again. Dylan was only a first year, yet his questions were oddly broad. Why is he researching that? Snape gave a mirthless laugh. Love potion makes people feel intense adoration, but it isn't real emotion. He brought it up, and at first I thought he was being foolish, but then... Snape's face darkened. He understands what a love potion does. What he wants to know is, since a potion can create false feelings, could potions that produce emotions be brewed to replace a twisted mind? You think he plans to use potions to facilitate dark arts? Dumbledore asked. That appears likely, Snape said. If he can induce the right emotional state, he might convince himself or others that the dark arts are acceptable. Dumbledore pondered, then couldn't help but smile with a hint of morbid curiosity. So, could it be done? No. Snape's expression was as stormy as the sky. No, it shouldn't be possible. Dumbledore's chuckle turned dry. He thought about it. The child always has strange, seemingly plausible ideas. Admittedly, Snape went on, I never considered whether potion-produced emotions could substitute for a corrupted mind, thus allowing one to use the dark arts. His brows knitted. Dumbledore cleared his throat. Regardless of whether it is possible, the dark arts are dangerously convenient. Their consequences are irreversible. A wizard who uses them without restraint will eventually be twisted by them. Hearing that, Snape's severity eased a little. I asked him directly if he had learned dark arts, he said. He denied it. He says he only wants to study the differences between dark arts and ordinary spells. And you believe him? Dumbledore asked softly. Snape was sure. Yes, I'm certain he was not lying. He truly wants to research them. Dumbledore nodded slowly. He had no reason to doubt Snape. 3 professors had come to him that night with complaints about Dylan, but none of it proved he had gone astray. The boy's ideas were the product of an overactive imagination and a lack of certain magical common sense, not malice. Most importantly, Dylan asked professors about his questions. He sought guidance. That alone showed his intentions were not dark. He's still young, Dumbledore said. We have time to guide him, and he's a Gryffindor. Dark wizards seldom come from there. Snape's eyelids twitched. Humph. He swept his black robes and strode from the room. Dumbledore watched him go, then fell into thought, expression solemn. A night of wind and snow left Hogwarts carpeted in fresh white. It was bitter outside, but Dylan was reluctant to get up. He'd discovered a new use for the robe beautification charm. For 100 galleons, he could alter his wizard robe into warm pajamas, fleece-lined and snug. It was a shame the enchantment wasn't permanent. Turning the pajamas back into a robe didn't cost him anything. But to change it into pajamas again would require another 100 galleons. So expensive, he muttered. And the effect doesn't even stick. Cole Ball, tucked in his arms, snuggled closer as Dylan sat up. He didn't immediately change his pajamas back into a robe. Instead, he noticed a mountain of packages at his feet. So many, he murmured, half buried under the covers. He poked his head out, and Cole Ball peered out from the collar as well. Dylan unwrapped the largest parcel. Wow! The first things he saw were a Gryffindor scarf and glove set. He rubbed the soft magical wool. It regulated temperature automatically. A card told him it was from Professor McGonagall. There was also a copy of Advanced Transfiguration, a guide to complex biological transfiguration, and a full year's run of last year's issues of Transfiguration Today. Dylan's face lit up. Transfiguration Today published papers by leading scholars in the field. Reading even a few issues had already helped him a great deal. Buying a whole year had been out of reach before. The magazine required a request letter, accepted subscriptions only at the start of the year, and allocated them sparingly. Bookshops rarely carried back issues. This gift is too generous, Dylan said to himself, glancing at the pile. Compared to this, my gift. Chapter 56, Christmas Gifts. Dylan thought back over the presents he'd given the professors. Most of them had cost less than a galleon, not because he didn't care, but because many were handmade. For Professor McGonagall, he had transfigured a piece of wood into a little tabby cat shaped like a lucky cat, its paw magically waving up and down. He hoped the professors wouldn't dislike his gifts. He'd put his heart into preparing them. After that, Dylan loaded everything Professor McGonagall had given him into his system panel and moved on to the next gift. Professor Flitwick had handed him a notebook full of dueling experience, the professor's own, handwritten notes. That kind of knowledge was priceless. The techniques and insights inside could easily be worth more than 10,000 galleons. Dylan smiled and tucked it away. The next box was from Professor Snape. He opened it and carefully lifted out a small bottle. When he held it up, tiny motes of magic swirled in the amber liquid. "An invigoration draught?" he murmured. He was surprised. The draught was a high-level potion that could rapidly restore magical energy and stamina, invaluable in dire situations. It was also difficult to brew. One of its required ingredients was under strict control nowadays, dragon heartstring. Even a trace was hard to come by. Dylan couldn't help but grin. So Professor Snape doesn't think I'm just a bothersome Gryffindor after all. He felt touched, but also a little self-conscious. He'd only given Snape a potion he'd made himself. He wondered if the professor had thought little of it. "One day when I have money, I'll give them all proper gifts," he promised himself. Dylan moved on. There were boxes of candy and chocolate, avocado chocolates he'd once conjured, which made him smile when he recognized Ron's handwriting on the tag. A battered, slightly singed football, enchanted apparently, from Seamus and Dean. The football had survived a magical explosion when Seamus was practicing a new spell. Seamus had dubbed it the Lucky Football and hoped it would bring Dylan luck. It might be useless as a ball, but Dylan loved it for what it represented. There was also the latest enchanted quill set from Harry, a thoughtful and somewhat expensive present. He gathered the gifts and felt warm with gratitude. He glanced at his bed. Harry and Ron were still asleep, faces peaceful. Dylan smirked and climbed quietly out of bed. After breakfast, he went to the owlery to check on Luna, but there was no letter from his parents. He shrugged it off. "I wasn't really expecting one," he told himself, and headed back to the common room instead of the library. He settled into a soft sofa with a heap of snacks and began reading the periodical McGonagall had given him. He was just getting absorbed in a Transfiguration article when familiar voices interrupted him. "Good morning, Merry Christmas." "Dylan, you're up so early." He looked up to see Harry and Ron grinning at him. Harry's face was alight. This was his first proper Christmas with friends. He flopped down on the sofa next to Dylan with a contented sigh. Ron came over and gave Dylan a sly look. "I saw your bed. Your presents are gone. Did you eat the chocolate I gave you?" Dylan glanced at him. "Avocado chocolate? No, not yet." Ron's hopeful expression collapsed. "Oh, why not? You didn't think it was actually the avocado one I gave you, did you?" Harry, trying not to laugh, said, "I told you not to use Dylan's packaging for pranks." Ron protested, then tried a different tack. "It wasn't the one you gave me, honestly. Dylan, try it. Go on." Dylan watched Ron's eyes darting and his lips twitch. He raised an eyebrow. "You didn't make some prank chocolate, did you?" Ron's smile froze and fell. "How could I? It's just a box of ordinary chocolates." Harry chimed in. "He gave me a box, too. I've already eaten mine. They were delicious." Dylan narrowed his eyes at the pair of them, then decided to play along. He pulled a handful of milk candies from his pocket. "I'll eat these later," he said, offering them with a disarming smile. "These are from your brothers. Want to try one?" Ron went instantly suspicious. Harry, oblivious, reached forward and took a candy from Dylan's hand, unwrapped it, and popped it into his mouth before anyone could stop him. For a beat, Harry smiled. Then something burst out of his mouth. A long, colorful ribbon shot from between his lips, streaming like a fountain. It kept coming and coming and coming. Harry clapped a hand to his mouth, eyes wide. "Mmph, mmph." The ribbon unspooled all over the sofa, coiling and piling until the cushions were buried. Harry tried to speak to stop it, but only more ribbon flowed. Panic flashed across his face. "What? What's happening?" Laughter cut through the chaos. "Ha! I didn't expect Dylan not to eat my candy, but Harry did." Two figures darted into the room, grinning like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Dylan is still so smart," one of them crowed. The Great Hall on Christmas was quieter than usual. The few witches and wizards who had stayed at Hogwarts were scattered about, but those sitting together made a cheerful group. Ron pulled Harry along, and the Weasley twins hauled Percy over. Dylan sat with them, and their lunch was lively, except for an occasional chill that seemed to drift from the professor's table. When Dylan looked up, though, no one there was glaring at him. Professor McGonagall, flushed and smiling, was even sipping a little wine, her hat slightly askew. She caught Dylan's eye and gave him a friendly nod. He smiled back. After lunch, as they were leaving the hall, Harry and Ron tried to drag Dylan into a snowball fight. The twins, who had been excited moments before, suddenly went flat. Percy glanced at them and realized they must have tried to prank Dylan earlier and then been on the receiving end of a rather harsh lesson. Just as Percy was about to comment, Dylan waved them off. "I need to return some books to the library. You two go have fun." "But it's Christmas, Dylan," Ron began, oblivious to his brother's embarrassment, and tried again to persuade him. Dylan managed to slip away. "Those 3 books I borrowed are almost due. After I return them, I'll pick up a couple more detailed herbology texts." Around a corner on the path, he nearly collided with Professor Snape, black robes billowing. "Oh, Professor Snape! What a coincidence! Merry Christmas," Dylan said cheerfully. Snape's expression was as dark as ever. "I am not pleased," he said flatly. Dylan blinked. Snape continued, his voice flat and measured. "At lunch, Professor McGonagall could not stop praising the gift you gave her. Professor Flitwick paraded a musical score you composed. The gifts you gave the other professors were considerable." Dylan's face warmed. He had not expected the professors to compare notes. Then Snape's thin lips pursed, and he listed, each name clipped and precise. Relaxation tea bags, skin-brightening potion, mood-soothing draught, hair-refreshing elixir. "What did you mean by giving me these?" Dylan fumbled. I just thought, Professor, that you could look even more handsome." "There's a saying in the Muggle world," he added, trying to smooth it out. "A smile can make you look 10 years younger." "I only wanted you to stand out at Hogwarts." Snape narrowed his eyes. The shadow under his lids made his hooked nose seem sharper. His greasy black hair shifted with the slightest tilt of his head. "So you mean I am old?" "Oh no, I didn't mean that. Don't say that!" Dylan protested too quickly. He stumbled over his words. "Professor Snape, if you were old, then the headmaster would." He realized how badly that had sounded and coughed twice to cover it up. "Of course. Anyway, the tea and the potions were made by me, so they're only a small token of my respect. My birthday's soon," he added in a rush. "I'll give you something special. You'll be surprised." Snape's expression flickered, the faintest lift to his eyebrows, but he snorted coldly. "I hope it is not a fright." "It won't be," Dylan said, laughing awkwardly. After a little more back and forth, he finally sent the obstinate professor on his way. He released a long breath, but now the problem of finding an appropriate birthday gift gnawed at him. "This wand beautification only seems to work on my own wand," he muttered to himself. "If it worked on his, I could give his wand pink bunny attack effects, or a scabby snake charm might do." He spent the afternoon in the library turning ideas over, but nothing settled. Later, when Harry crept in excitedly to tell him about the invisibility cloak, Dylan hardly listened at first, his mind busy. Then, seeing Harry's face, an idea flashed through his head. Wand effects won't work, he thought, but what if I bring Harry to Professor Snape and give Harry a good whack with a wand right in front of him? Harry, mid-sentence, froze and shivered. "Huh? What's wrong?" Dylan seemed distracted. Harry and Ron nosed closer, curiosity flickering. Dylan, deciding not to overthink it, used Scourgify on himself and went to bed early, hugging his coal ball. Sleep first, he told himself. Figure it out tomorrow. He kept his routine. Up early, tidy, then off to the hall. He poured a glass of milk and helped himself to steaming English breakfast sausages. He cut into one with knife and fork. The casing was lightly crisped, oil hissing, and when he bit it, the smell of meat filled the air. 2 thick slices of toast, baked in a magic oven, crisp outside, tender inside, were spread with butter that melted slightly into the warm bread. He had poached eggs and a few roasted tomatoes and felt quite satisfied. Just as he reached for some fruit, Harry skittered over and dropped onto the bench beside him. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Dylan, do you know what I saw last night?" Dylan arched an eyebrow. "Your parents?" Harry's delighted expression faltered. "How did you?" "I guessed," Dylan said. Harry's thrill dimmed a little, but he still wanted to tell. "I only meant to try the invisibility cloak, but I ended up in the restricted section. Filch chased me all the way. Of course, the most important thing is... Chapter 58, Encounter with the Magic Mirror. You found a mirror, and you saw your parents in it? Dylan popped a black currant into his mouth from a small plate of berries that looked like grapes. Harry nodded over and over. It reflected my parents. They were standing right behind me. Harry murmured, lost in the memory. They looked so good when they smiled. Ron, who had wandered in halfway through the story, blinked drowsily and grabbed a piece of bread. What a magical experience. Why didn't you bring me? I'd like to know what your mom and dad look like, too. My brother says they're heroes, Ron added. Harry's smile brightened. Then why don't we go back tonight? That way I can see your family, too. Harry had received gifts from the Weasleys for Christmas, and yesterday had felt, to him, like the best Christmas of his life. If you like, when summer vacation starts, you can come stay with me, Ron offered casually. Harry agreed at once. Ron turned to Dylan. What about you, Dylan? Want to come? We still have gnomes in the garden. We can play with them. Or chase goblins. My parents hide all sorts of magical treasures. There's plenty to explore. Ron grinned. Dylan blinked. He listened to Harry and Ron's eager faces and thought of his own parents, busy with work and their private lives, perhaps even hoping for another child. He snorted inwardly, then nodded. Okay, we can hang out over summer. Great. Don't spend every day with those boring books, or my mum will use you as an example to lecture me, Ron laughed. I'll try, Dylan allowed, not fully committing. Harry then asked, Dylan, do you want to come tonight? We can see your parents in the mirror together. Let's forget it. When Harry had mentioned the invisibility cloak the day before, Dylan had already thought of the Mirror of Erised. The mirror's full name was the Mirror of Erised, Erised being desire, spelled backwards, and the name, in some myths, also belonged to a goddess of discord. It was said to show a person their deepest longing. Dylan was a little curious, but not enough to risk showing it to anyone who might spy. The mirror wouldn't simply reflect family members like Harry imagined. What if it showed something strange for him? If Dumbledore happened to be nearby and saw whatever the mirror revealed, the consequences could be bad. He had no desire to drag anyone into that. Are you really not coming? Harry persisted. I've already got arrangements with Professors Flitwick and McGonagall, Dylan said. Did you make an appointment with Snape? Ron asked. No, Dylan admitted. What a pity. Dylan finished his berries and decided to go to Professor Snape's office. That prickly, stubborn professor would have to be coaxed. Dylan knocked, buttered Snape up for a while, and was rewarded with a long session of potions practice in Snape's office that day. The next morning, after class with Flitwick, the professor discussed some matters related to defense against the dark arts. As a Ravenclaw graduate, Flitwick had a knack for cutting through confusions and pointing out insights that made things click for Dylan. In the afternoon, Dylan went over Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall. She forbade any continued research into the entropy splitting curse, but had an in-depth conversation with him about spell shaping and secondary control. Just before dusk, as Dylan left McGonagall's office, planning to grab a quick dinner and consolidate all he'd learned, he passed an empty classroom and stopped. The door was half closed. Inside, a full-length mirror stood against the far wall. Is this the abandoned classroom Harry mentioned? He wondered. The place did look familiar. Maybe Dumbledore had arranged for the cloak to be returned and left the mirror here on purpose. He checked the corridor. No sign of Harry. If Harry wasn't around, Dumbledore probably wasn't either. Dylan slipped into the classroom and closed the door gently behind him. Just a quick look, he told himself. A glance isn't going to hurt. He pulled his wand and walked 3 circles around the mirror. He didn't sense any other presence. Slightly reassured, he stepped in front of the glass and read the inscription above it, backward as the stories went. I show not your face, but your heart's desire. The mirror's surface seemed veiled in a thin mist. As Dylan's reflection came into view, the mist thinned and an image resolved. It was a spring afternoon. Dylan and his parents had left their cramped little home and moved into a villa. He no longer woke in a tiny basement, but in a large bed that let him greet a lazy morning sun. And when he went out into the yard, his parents were laying out delicacies on a long garden table. 2 small figures, Children, who must be his younger siblings, ran and laughed across the grass, and somewhere nearby they were beating gnomes. Dylan blinked. His parents wanted another child? Did he want a younger sister? The question surprised him. The scene shifted. A stream of guests came up the path toward the garden. Dylan and his parents welcomed them. Hermione carried a thick book of magical plant illustrations and pointed out the enchanted flora surrounding the house. Harry and Ron were there too, playing with Dylan's little siblings and tussling with gnomes. Neville, Seamus, George, friends and faces he knew, milled about. Even the professors appeared. Snape, McGonagall, Flitwick. Snape's expression remained severe as ever, but when Dylan's parents greeted him, he saw, for a moment, the corner of Snape's mouth soften into something almost like a kind smile. "A garden party," Dylan whispered, and couldn't help smiling back at the mirror. Chapter 59, Dumbledore's Test. Achievement Reward, Continuous Spellcasting. Dylan hadn't expected that what he truly wanted in his heart would turn out to be something so simple, a group of people having a party in the garden. He blinked at the image in the mirror of Erised, sunny sky, music, laughter, and then noticed something dark flicker at the very top of the mirror's reflection, like a cloud briefly staining the blue. It vanished almost as soon as it appeared. He squinted. What was he thinking about? His stomach growled. A wave of hunger hit him. He looked at the food his parents had spread out in the reflection, all the things he'd loved since childhood. Of course, England being what it was, there were still plenty of items on the table that smelled like the processed treats from his previous life. He even spotted cans that looked suspiciously like Coca-Cola and Sprite. He licked his lips. "I'm a bit hungry. Better go eat." If only he could conjure such delicacies with a flick of a wand. It would be convenient, like the milk tea he'd managed to make through his transfiguration research. He pushed the classroom door open, glanced left and right, found no one, and slipped away. As Dylan left, space behind the mirror of Erised rippled, and two figures stepped through. Dumbledore sighed softly, watching the remaining scene in the mirror. Harry and the professors mingling with music, children running about, and Dylan himself moving among family and friends with a warm, contented smile. "This child can never fall to the dark arts," Dumbledore murmured. "He will not learn dark magic." He smiled as he spoke. "I just don't know what that dark liquid he used to entertain guests is. It looks like a kind of beverage." In Dylan's reflection, Dylan himself was there too, seated kindly on a lounge chair, watching the children play. It was a rare, wholesome sight. As the scene in the mirror faded, Dumbledore raised a hand to his face to brush away the moisture welling at the corner of his eyes. Snape's lips tightened. He kept his eyes on his own figure in the reflection until it disappeared. "I couldn't possibly smile like that," he said. Dumbledore was amused. "What if you did?" He turned toward the classroom door. "You can rest easy about this child, can't you?" Snape snorted. "With a motionless mirror, people move." Dumbledore looked back at the mirror, and the image that remained made him pause. His eyes grew misty again, and he looked away. "Severus, people are ever-changing, but those embraced by love, no matter how they change, can keep their truest selves. Perhaps you don't understand," he added quietly, "but love has a power that transcends everything, life and death included. So you must believe that a person's true self will be reflected in the mirror of Erised." Snape's gaze shifted. He was silent a moment before grunting. "Humph. Considering he understood the mirror's inscription at once, I'll grudgingly accept that a truly intelligent person won't truly fall." Dumbledore chuckled and appraised Snape. "Severus, your hair looks far healthier today. Your skin seems brighter and younger too. It's a very pleasant change." Snape twitched a corner of his mouth. "Stop talking nonsense." He lifted a foot to leave, but Dumbledore called after him. "Severus, teach that child legilimency and occlumency." Snape froze, turned, and frowned. "He's only a first year. Why would he need those?" Dumbledore smiled faintly. "He's a kind and diligent child. If, as principal and head of house, we are to use our power to pry into the secrets of a student with an upright heart, we owe him a compensation." Then Dumbledore turned and walked on. Snape watched the old man go, his eye sockets shadowed. After a moment, he reached up to touch his hair and then his cheek. "This boy's rather good at brewing unusual potions," he muttered. With a soft snort, Snape strode away. His steps, for all their usual briskness, seemed a degree lighter than before. Meanwhile, Dylan reached the great hall. Although he had wanted to gorge himself, he simply took a dozen small dishes, set them before him, and ate. After finishing, he returned to the dormitory, cast Scourgify on himself, and sat down on his bed to check the system notifications. Achievement: Prying into the heart. You have glimpsed your truest self. Requirement to unlock: peer into your inner self through the mirror of Erasid. Achievement: Spell Chain 10. Dylan raised an eyebrow. This time, the reward wasn't galleons or magical talent or rare herbs, just 4 words that implied he could cast spells in succession, and multiplied by 10. Does that mean I can cast 10 identical spells in a row? He couldn't help picturing it, standing against Lord Voldemort, wand raised, and when Voldemort unleashed a Fiendfire curse, Dylan flicked and sent off 10 Fiendfire like fireworks, all striking Voldemort in the face. What would the reward be if he defeated Voldemort with pink fluffy bunnies? Smiling at the ridiculous image, Dylan pulled out his wand and decided to test the reward. Petrificus Totalis! Magic leapt from his wand and struck the small items on his bedside table. One wooden carving went rigid. He didn't stop. Petrificus Totalis! The wand kept pouring out magic. Tap, tap, tap. The scattered objects stiffened one after another. The whole process was astonishingly smooth. After casting Petrificus Totalis 10 times in succession, however, Dylan felt his concentration waver. His mental energy seemed slightly dispersed. He shook his head and suppressed the lightheaded feeling. Phew! It looked like casting 10 spells at once took some getting used to. Chapter 60. Learn the counterspells of the dark arts. Although I'd already mastered several high-level dark arts spells, aside from the 3 unforgivable curses, I still needed to learn how to counter them as soon as possible. The Christmas break slipped by. Harry and Ron and I kept slipping down to the mirror of Erasid late at night to look at our reflections. Eventually, Dumbledore found out and removed the mirror, which left Harry pretty downcast. I didn't have much time to console him, though. I'd been spending the holidays studying counter curses for dark arts spells. For some reason, Professor Flitwick, who had at first been reluctant to teach me any of it, not only agreed to show me the counter for the Fiendfire curse, but surprisingly offered to teach several other dark arts counter curses as well. I'd been learning from him during those days, while juggling a dozen other plans. Preparing to venture into the Forbidden Forest, figuring out where Acromantulas nested, how to collect their venom safely, and the right times to enter and exit without being seen. I couldn't neglect my other classes either. Progress had to be made across the board, all of which made my schedule ridiculously full, even on holiday. While practicing the counter curse for Fiendfire one afternoon, I remembered something else. Next year, the defense against the dark arts professor would change again. I couldn't recall his full name, something like Chang, but I remembered his reputation perfectly. His defensive magic was mediocre, but he was a master of the memory charm and unbelievably showy, always eager to collect autographs. He'd built his career on stealing other people's work and passing it off as his own. I remembered he'd once tried to use a memory charm on Harry and Ron. Ron's wand backfired, the spell rebounded, and the man himself lost his memory and was sent to St. Mungo's for long-term treatment. He wasn't useful in most ways, but he did have one advantage. If I could get his autograph once he was a professor, I might be able to borrow books from the restricted section. Flitwick had taught me a few counter curses, but I needed to consult more sources. If I could bring my theories to the restricted section and verify them, I wouldn't have to reinvent everything on my own, and I wouldn't have every idea dismissed as unorthodox in front of the staff. I was calm about it. No one is completely useless, and I wasn't above using other people's vanity to my advantage. I gave a small, private chuckle and tapped my wand against the palm of my hand. Dark arts counter curses weren't as difficult for me as most people would assume. In essence, they're reversals or inversions of the original dark arts enchantments. Since I'd already reached a level most would call profound in the 6 major branches of dark arts, learning their counters felt like unpicking a knot that I'd tied myself. I waited until the dormitory was empty, then hid in my room and practiced. Fiendfire, I said, flicking my wand. A tongue of pink flame spurted from the tip and took shape. A fluffy, lifelike pink rabbit. It hopped in midair, right, twisting and turning at my command. It leapt toward Harry's bed, and I let it get close enough to frighten myself before I spun my wand again. The Fiendfire rabbit bounded into the pile of wood I'd prepared. Sizzle. The wood went up in an instant. The flames were voracious, and for a heartbeat I watched them threaten to spread across the dormitory. Then I cast the counter. Swish! A second stream of pink light shot from my wand and wrapped itself around the rabbit. It thrashed and snapped at the magic with a sizzling, tongue-like heat, trying to escape, but it couldn't break the hold. With a high, terrified squeal and a final crackling pop, the Fiendfire collapsed into a charred remnant on the floor. Reparo. I pointed my wand at the scorched patch. A pink glow washed over the blackened wood, but the mark merely trembled. Within a second, the light dissipated like foam in air. The burn didn't mend. The scar remained stubborn and black. I hadn't expected Reparo to fix it. Fiendfire was notoriously difficult to reverse completely. Its residue resisted ordinary restoration. I stood up slowly, pulled down the corner of Harry's sheet, and let it fall so the charred patch was hidden beneath the bed. Satisfied, I smoothed the sheet and returned to my bed, folding my hands in my lap. If I needed to practice dark arts and their counters on a larger scale, the Room of Requirement was the obvious choice. It was hidden, magically protected, and changed to suit whatever need a person had. Most importantly, it resisted magical detection. In there, I could experiment freely on more dangerous magic without worrying that Dumbledore would notice every spark and question. Maybe I was worrying too much. Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of our era, but he was human. He'd even used his own life as bait to set up Lord Voldemort before. He couldn't possibly know everything. I let myself relax a fraction. I'd keep preparing, keep learning, and when the time came, I'd go to the Room of Requirement and test my ideas properly.